He walked into that studio carrying someone else's guitar case, and nobody even knew his name. 40 minutes later, the owner of Stax Records signed him on the spot, and the man who came in as a driver never drove anyone anywhere again. It was October of 1962, and on the corner of East Macklemore Avenue in Memphis, Tennessee, there was a building that did not look like much from the outside. It had been a movie theater once. By 1962, the seats had been ripped out and the screen had come down. In the empty space where families once sat in the dark, a new kind of dream had taken root. The building was called Stax Records. Black musicians and white musicians were playing together inside those walls, creating a sound that was raw and urgent and desperately alive. They called it soul. And on this particular October afternoon, a 21-year-old man from Macon, Georgia, pulled a car into the parking lot, cut the engine, and sat for a moment in the silence. His name was Otis Redding Jr. He was not there to record. He was not there to audition. He was there because Johnny Jenkins, the guitarist he worked for, needed a ride. That was all. Otis Redding was the driver. To understand what happened inside that building on that October afternoon, you have to go back to the beginning. Not the beginning of Otis at Stax, but the beginning of Otis himself. Because the man who walked through those doors in 1962 had been shaped by forces so powerful and so relentless that by the time he picked up a microphone, he was not just singing. He was releasing something that had been building inside him for 21 years. Otis Redding Jr. was born on September 9th, 1941, in Dawson, Georgia. His father, Otis Sr., worked as a sharecropper on a plantation. You worked someone else's land. You lived in someone else's house. You planted and harvested and sweated and bled. And at the end of the season, the man who owned the land took his share, and what was left for your family was barely enough to call a life. When Otis Jr. was 3 years old, the family packed everything they owned and left. They moved to Macon, Georgia. Otis Sr. got a job as a maintenance worker at Robins Air Force Base, and on Sundays he preached part-time at local churches. They settled in Tyndall Heights, a public housing project where the walls were thin and the children ran in the streets until the streetlights came on. 6 children, 2 small rooms. One shared understanding that the future was something you had to build with your own hands because nobody was going to hand it to you. Otis was different from the time he could stand upright. The old women at the Vineville Baptist Church knew the first Sunday morning he stood in the choir and opened his mouth. There was something in his voice that did not belong to a child. A roughness, a heat, as if his vocal cords had been worn smooth and then recarved by decades of living he had not yet done. When other children sang in church, you heard children singing. When Otis sang, you heard something else entirely. Something that made the hairs on the back of your neck stand up and made you forget, for just a moment, whatever it was you had been worrying about before the music started. When Otis was 15 years old, his father got sick. Tuberculosis. Suddenly, the man who had carried the family was lying in a hospital bed, unable to work, unable to preach, barely able to breathe. Otis dropped out of Ballard Hudson High School and went to work. He dug wells. He hauled bricks in the Georgia heat. He pumped gas and swung a hammer. But every night, no matter how tired he was, he sang. He sang on the porch. He sang walking home from work. Singing was not a choice for Otis Redding. It was as necessary as breathing. There was a talent show at the Douglas Theater in Macon. $5 to the winner. $5 was grocery money. Otis entered and sang a Little Richard song, and the audience came apart. He won. He came back the following week and won again. 15 consecutive weeks, Otis Redding walked into that talent show and walked out with the $5 prize, until the organizers told him he could not compete anymore. It was not fair to the other contestants. They had to ban him from winning. By the time Otis was 19 years old, he had been performing around Macon for years. He had a local reputation as something special, but local reputations are just that, local. The world outside of Macon had no idea that Otis Redding existed. And then he met Johnny Jenkins. Johnny Jenkins was a guitarist who led a group called Johnny Jenkins and the Pine Toppers. Through a young promoter named Phil Walden, Jenkins got a recording session at Stax Records in Memphis, Tennessee. Stax was a small independent label operating out of a converted movie theater run by Jim Stewart, and his sister Estelle Axton. In the deeply segregated American South of the early 1960s, Stax was a place where black and white musicians sat down together and made music. The house band was integrated. Booker T. Jones on keyboards was black. Steve Cropper on guitar was white. Donald Duck Dunn on bass was white. Al Jackson Jr. on drums was black. In 1962 Memphis, this was radical, and the music they made together was something that no fully segregated band could have made. Johnny Jenkins had his session at Stax. Otis drove him there in a station wagon. The session was not going well. Jenkins was talented, but the material was not clicking, and Jim Stewart could feel it. That particular studio tension that happens when something is not working and nobody wants to be the first one to say so. The session wound down. There was studio time left over. 40 minutes, maybe a little more. And someone, the accounts differ slightly on exactly who, looked over at the young man sitting quietly in the corner of the studio and said the words that changed American music forever. Something along the lines of, "Do you want to try something?" Otis Redding stood up. He walked to the microphone. He had a song he had been carrying around in his head for a while. A ballad. The kind of slow, aching love song that sounds simple until you try to write one and realize that simplicity at that level is actually one of the hardest things in the world to achieve. He called the song "These Arms of Mine." He had written it thinking about the feeling of needing someone so badly that the absence of them was a physical thing, a weight on your arms, an emptiness in your hands. He opened his mouth and began to sing. Steve Cropper was in the control room. He had heard a lot of singers come through Stax, but when Otis Redding's voice came through those studio monitors for the first time, Cropper put down whatever he was holding and stared through the glass. What he was hearing was not a singer performing a song. It was a human being bleeding. The voice cracked in places. It was not polished. It did not sound like any of the slick rhythm and blues singers working the charts at that time. It sounded completely unfiltered, raw in the way that only real things are raw. Like watching a person cry when they do not know anyone is watching. Jim Stewart walked out of the control room and offered Otis Redding a recording contract. Not Johnny Jenkins. Otis Redding, the driver, the man nobody knew, the 21-year-old from Macon who had come to Memphis to carry someone else's guitar and ended up carrying an entire genre forward on the strength of 40 minutes and one song. Otis signed a contract and called his mother from a payphone outside. He made the people around him feel like everything was going to be all right, even when he had no guarantee that it was. Especially then. What followed was one of the most extraordinary careers in the history of American popular music. These Arms of Mine crept up the rhythm and blues charts. Then came Pain in My Heart, Mr. Pitiful, I Have Been Loving You Too Long, and Respect. The song Aretha Franklin would later transform into a feminist anthem that Otis celebrated with nothing but pride. Then Try a Little Tenderness, a performance so emotionally overwhelming that audiences at his live shows would stop moving entirely, unable to process what they were witnessing. Stax Records became Otis Redding's home. Steve Cropper became his closest musical collaborator. The house band became his family. And Memphis became the place where Otis Redding's music found its fullest expression. He took everything that had made him, the poverty of Tyndall Heights, the tuberculosis that had stolen his father's strength, the 15 talent show victories and the band that followed, the wells he had dug and the bricks he had hauled. He poured all of it into the microphone, not as therapy, but as a gift, because Otis Redding understood that his pain was not only his. Every person who had ever been poor, every person who had ever carried someone else's load, they were all in that room with him when he sang. He was not performing for an audience. He was singing on behalf of everyone who had never had the words. That October afternoon in 1962 lasted 40 minutes. 40 minutes between the moment Otis Redding stood up from his chair in the corner of a converted movie theater and the moment Jim Stewart offered him a contract. 40 minutes that rewrote the history of American music. The driver became the star. The man nobody knew became the man nobody could forget. And the guitar case he had carried into that building for someone else went right back in the station wagon, because Otis Redding was never going to carry anyone else's load again. If this story moved you, If you felt something listening to the journey of a 21-year-old driver who walked into a room with nothing but a voice and walked out with a destiny, subscribe to this channel and ring the notification bell so you never miss another story like this one. Share this video with someone who needs to be reminded that the most extraordinary chapters sometimes begin in the most ordinary moments. Leave a comment below telling us, have you ever been in the right place at the right time and felt the entire direction of your life shift beneath your feet? Because every great story, just like this one, starts with someone who refused to believe that they were only the driver.